She's really, really well placed to share her thoughts with us, which she has entitled How Old the New, which I think is a wonderful title, thank you, Fran, and is reflecting on Janet Stewart as an educator and relating it in the movement that much of the input is echoing from the past to the present. So she's relating Janet Stewart as an educator to the current Sacred Heart goals, past and present, with a look to the future. So thank you, Fran.
If I sound breathless, it's because I realized that I had forgotten the text in my room about 5 minutes of 11. So I also feel that it takes a certain temerity to stand up here after what we heard this morning. It was so beautiful and so moving. So I hope you will find this total change of pace. I hope you will find it interesting. Yes, the title, How Old the New. In the introduction to the education of Catholic girls, there is a very brief statement that says that in 1910, a book was published in the United States with the title, Education, How Old the New. And the introduction goes on to say that a companion volume might be written with an alternative title, How New the Old, and both would make the same point. And I think that that's what I would feel that I'd like to develop to some degree. And I chose to develop this topic by looking at the current expression of Sacred Heart philosophy, namely the goals and criteria of Sacred Heart schools, which, as most of you probably know, were developed in the United States in the 1970s and subsequently shared all around the society, so that there are many provinces that are using either the goals as they are written with the various criteria, or they're using alternate versions. Now, much of what I'm going to say will repeat or echo what you already know. I'm not going to say, as you know, every other sentence, but I'm aware of that. Now, just before her election as Superior General in 1911, Mother Stewart gathered together the reflections in her many conferences on the educational tradition of the society, and she restated them for her early 20th century British context. She was aware that education was at a new moment. Even though the Society's plan of studies had frequently been updated all through the 19th century, she realized that a thorough revision was called for. She liked to quote Montalembert, who said, "We must not do what our fathers did, but we must do what they would do were they here today." And her paraphrase was, "We must not do what our mothers did, but what they would do today." And she planned that when it would be possible to convene a general congregation of the society, that there would be a revision of the complete revision of the plan. And as you know, she did not live to convene that council, but in 1922 there was a complete revision of the plan of studies by the general congregation. And in the words of Mary Quinlan, Mother Stewart is all over that plan. She's quoted in it, and her theories are reflected in the conclusions to which it came. The plan was again revised, I would say even reconceived, in the 1950s. And then in the 1970s, the leaders of our schools in the US realized that it was again a new moment. And not so much because of the changes in education, but because we realized that Sacred Heart educators of the future would be to a great extent our lay colleagues. It was obvious that a clear and contemporary statement of our educational philosophy and aims was necessary if the schools were to continue as Sacred Heart schools. In other words, to remain ourselves, as Janet Stewart herself wrote. And with the formulation of the goals and criteria, Sacred Heart educators in the US re-expressed the tradition in order to carry it forward. The resulting set of goals was adopted by the 5 provinces that we were then, and as I said, subsequently shared around the society. The inspiration for this reformulation was in large measure the expression of the charism of the General Chapter of 1970 of the Society. Now, the network, as it was established to maintain these goals, make sure they were followed, set up a process of evaluation by a committee of network educators that allows each school to reflect on how it's carrying out the goals. And an interesting development over time has been that a school from outside the network, a school not founded by the Society of the Sacred Heart, can, by adopting the goals and criteria and by undergoing a process of evaluation, become a network school. And so far that has happened 3 times in the United States. Princeton Academy in New Jersey, the Regis Academy in Houston, Texas, and the Josephinum in Chicago have joined the network in this way, and they're full members and take part in all our activities. I might recall here, too, that Mother Stewart visited the United States twice, once as Mother Digby's companion in 1898-99, when she gave a series of conferences on education, both at Maryville in St. Louis and at Manhattanville in New York. The second time was at the end of her journey around the world in the summer of 1914, when she held a council of studies and gave a retreat to superiors at Manhattanville. Besides her presence, actually, there were some American RSCJ who were trained at Roehampton under Mother Stewart. And Mother Digby sent a few English religious over to the States to shape us up. Among them were people whose names have gone down in our story, Amy Gurdon and Josephine Errington. And the most important one was probably Reverend Mother Gertrude Bodkin. Irish, but from this vicariate. Yes, yeah, and trained by Mother Stewart. Yes, Irish. And she, you probably know she was one of four Bodkins that the family gave to the society. She was novice mistress from 1909 to 1931. So that whole generation, or almost 2 generations, were formed by her. And then she was superior vicar in the East from 31 to 53. As a result of these people, as well as her own presence, Mother Stewart's influence has been a factor in our formation, and consequently has been felt in the schools. I asked various people in the schools now if they thought Mother Stewart's hand had been operative in the formulation of the goals and criteria. And the consensus I heard was that there was no deliberate, conscious invoking of her teaching, but those who developed the goals and criteria had in mind their whole formation and the whole tradition of the Society's education from the beginning, our special characteristic, if you will. Mother Stewart's insights, developed and expressed in her conferences and her writings, are implicit here. So I set myself the task of finding some points of connection or resonances. I see evidence of her thinking, especially in the criteria. And as I quote her writings, I suggest that you read the criteria that will be posted and see if you see points of contact. I'd like to focus on 3 points specifically. Her understanding of God and its relevance for teaching, especially what we've just heard this morning, and the development of the intellect and personal growth. Now, the first goal that Sacred Heart schools set for themselves is a personal and active faith in God. We've just heard how Janet Stewart saw God. In the education of Catholic girls, she says that teachers must be careful to give students right thoughts of God. In contrast to a God who's an exacting judge, a punisher, we teachers must present God as infinitely loving and merciful, a God who is the source of all good gifts, a God with whom we can have a relationship that is full of consolation. She wrote, "The child has a right to learn the best that it can of God, since the happiness of its life, not only in eternity, but even in time, is bound up in that knowledge." And she wrote to one of her spiritual daughters, "You have not right thoughts of God yet. Think the best and the sweetest thoughts and believe them, but you can never reach half of what God is." Right thoughts, in her phrase, are the only basis for the relationship with God that the school seeks to promote. She deplores the tendency to stress evil, the threat of losing one's soul, as if it were a danger at every step. Not the most inspiring ideal of life, she adds. Right thoughts of ourselves and our destiny are the necessary condition for the sense of hope that the school hopes to inspire. All that belongs to hope awakens a far more effective response to good than the thoughts of punishment or eternal damnation. And finally, thoughts of Jesus Christ and his mother foster the relationship with God that will see students through life. She did not see the world into which graduates were going through rose-colored glasses. She's open-eyed about the challenges to faith and morals that young women will face, and she stresses all the more solid grounding in the elements of faith. She says they must have been so taught that the practice of religion has become the atmosphere of a happy life. Let us now move to the second goal, one with which Mother Stewart would be much in sympathy: respect for intellectual values. According to the criteria by which this goal is judged, the schools make sure that they are instilling intellectual values by basing the curriculum on solid educational research and evaluation, by demanding serious work, especially original, critical thinking and reflection. Mother Stewart has much to say about intellectual honesty, which she often calls sincerity. Weak places in education show themselves when the least insincerity in the presentment of truth brings its own punishment. And a faith not pillared and grounded in all honesty is in danger of failing. The best security, she says, is in having nothing to unlearn, to know that what one knows is a very small part of what can be known, but that as far as it goes, it is true and genuine and cannot be outgrown. She was talking there about religious truth, but the same thing can be said of any discipline. The call is for teaching that is not only sincere, but grounded in the best research available. And she makes a fairly modern observation about research. It is well to make pupils understand that after years of specialized study, the really great men of science, in very gentle tones and with careful utterance, give to the world their formed opinions, keeping them forever open to readjustment as the results of fresh observations come in year after year, and to new discoveries call for correction and rearrangement of what has been previously taught. She acknowledged that intellectual honesty or sincerity is not easy to come by. She said it has its enemies: inertness of mind, the desire to do things cheaply, dislike of mental effort, the tendency to be satisfied with appearances, the wish to shine, impatience for results. And the opposite of these defects, mental activity, willingness to expend effort, indifference to mere appearances and superficial success, and patience, are all indications of a sincere quest for knowledge. So in the end, how do we measure success? She tells us in an oft-quoted passage from a conference in 1899, and you'll recognize this. Success, to be worthy of the name, must mean an end proposed and attained. We bring up children for the future, not for the present. Not that we may enjoy the fruit of the work, but for others. And then follow the familiar words, so we must remember that it is better to begin a great work than to finish a small one. They must leave us with some self-knowledge, some energy, some purpose. If they leave us without these three things, they drift with the stream of life. And later she said, a finished education is an illusion, or else a lasting disappointment. The very word implies a condition of mind which is opposed to any further development, a condition of self-satisfaction. Now, what about the teacher? Mother Stewart's teaching here, in some way, complements the criterion. The criterion says that the school is responsible to make sure that the faculty has opportunity for their own development. But Mother Stewart says, the teacher is responsible for himself. We must always be, and Sue quoted this for us, our first, our most cherished, our favorite pupil, always improving ourselves. And all those plays and essays that she wrote for community gatherings all had in mind to encourage and assist people in self-improvement, mental improvement. She gave the advice, develop a type, be somebody on the staff, and be interesting to pursue what she might have meant by that, to develop a type. But if there's one theme that pervades her teaching, whether to her novices or to young teachers, it is be yourself and be the best self that you can. Now, along with writing about lofty principles and moral qualities, she gives some very concrete and practical suggestions for developing intellectually. To read, to listen, to compare, inquire, to examine ourselves on accuracy, on saying what we mean, on exaggeration, on thoughtless formulas, to imagine less and reason more. Remember that the empty, vague, and flighty mind is very much at the mercy of the first thought that rushes into it. And finally, study. We must study much to be able to teach well. Study methods, otherwise we become mere textbook teachers. And she has very little good to say about the use of textbooks. The teacher, who she says, who possesses the material does not need to rely on a textbook, except to know the framework, the limits of what she ought to be teaching, or he. Now, with regard to children, she has some delightful things to say about children. Children, she says, like to find real people, not anxiously careful to improve them, but able to take life with a certain spontaneity, as they like to take it themselves. They are frightened by those who take themselves too seriously, who are too acute, too convincing, or too brilliant. They do not like people who appear to be always on the alert. The people whom they like and trust are usually quiet, simple people who have not startling ways and do not manifest those strenuous ideals which destroy all sense of leisure in life. And I don't know if people who know Janet Stewart well would think maybe she's, there's a little bit of self-accusation here, because I think she was a person with those strenuous ideals, and maybe she had to fight against that. The children, she says, and this is in another, in the same book but in another context, the children prefer to be taken seriously on their own ground. In general, things in general are so incomprehensible that it makes only matters worse to be approached with playful methods and facetious invitations into the unknown. Who can tell what educational ambush for their improvement may be concealed behind these demonstrations? We can infer that Mother Stewart was on the side of the children in her assessment of teachers. And the following is particularly telling. Apparently at the time there was a new focus on child study. So she says, if the children could combine the result of their observations and bring out a manual of teacher study, we should have strange revelations as to how it looks from the other side. We should be astonished at the shrewdness of the small juries that deliberate, and the insight of the judges that pronounce sentence upon us. And we should be convinced that to obtain a favorable verdict, we needed very little subtlety, not too much theory, but as much as possible of the very things we look for as the result and crown of our work. And then she enumerates some of those results. We labor to produce character, we must have it. We look for courage and uprightness, we must bring them with us. We want honest work, we have to give proof of it ourselves. We want to secure them as they grow up against the spirit of pessimism. Our own imperturbable hope in God and confidence in the church will be more convincing than our arguments. She did not have access to later research about differences in learning styles and the consequent need for individualized learning. But she had an instinct that children have to be taught how to learn. They do not know by instinct how to set about learning a lesson from a book, nor do they spontaneously recognize that there are different ways of learning adapted to different lessons. It's a help to teach them that there's one way to learn the multiplication table and another way to learn history and another to learn poetry. And she says further that we should be constantly evaluating, asking oneself, why am I teaching this subject? She urges the teacher to teach the children to define. That's excellent thinking work. And there are many other suggestions along those lines, but the final criterion for success in the classroom is this. There ought to be a class after which the children are never the same again. What an ambition. Now I'm going to move on to goal 5, the personal growth, for reasons of time, but also because there are so many echoes of goal 5 and its criteria in her thinking. Goal 5 aims at personal growth in an atmosphere of wise freedom. Students like this one best, especially the freedom part, while the teachers stress the wise. And Jan Dunn has a wonderful story about 2 little kids, I think they must have been middle schoolers, who came and said, Sister Dunn, we think we've made some unwise choices. So they take in this language as well as the concept. In the education of Catholic girls, Mother Stewart's thoughts around this topic are in those 2 chapters on character. She says the cry has been for character, for willpower, for consistency of conduct. All our ideals of education, Madeline Sophie Barra's teachings, the traditions, the constitutions, have been set out for this from the beginning, the training of character. Character has been defined as a completely fashioned will. Every line or department of teaching, if it does its duty, terminates in some way in the formation of character, a fashioning of the will, to which they will refer all parts and branches of education, as the old constitutions of 1815 said. Whether we speak of this end or the salvation of the soul, it comes to the same thing. The share given to the children in their own government, which was from the beginning and which we are now trying to renew, all work toward the same end, to develop initiative, power of control, sense of personal responsibility, decision, and fearlessness of character. And she states that vigilance on the part of the educator is the means by which this end of character development is achieved. She quotes the Roman poet Terence in saying, "Nothing human is strange to me." So she says, nothing regarding our children must be uninteresting to us. No mere sense of duty will make this vigilance possible. The standard given is that of a mother, and we know that her care is proverbial, or even God uses the mother's care as an illustration of God's own care. The second reason for our vigilance is the respect we owe to them as God's children, committed to our care, and of whom we have to give an account. And this is the principle of surveillance from our point of view. We must never lose sight of our charges, but watch over them respectfully and lovingly. At the same time, her experience told her that we must be realistic, and she commented, "Our standard of vigilance increases as we grow older. We must know that the children can do each other very great harm right under our eyes. I do not think we can naturally insure ourselves against this. The children are more numerous than we. They can easily forestall us. In addition to vigilance, she recommends prudence. Prudence would then consist in helping the children to make good use of time. Strong studies and good teaching do much to keep them out of mischief. If we're teaching well and the children are interested in their classwork, there will be few breaches of the school rule. If we can keep our children occupied from morning till night, they will not have time to be naughty. Prudence is again shown in punishment. The ideal is that each offense should be made to bring its own punishment, and that the children should be thus made to understand that it's less pleasant to be naughty than to be good. There's often a fascination about naughtiness, but we must minimize the fascination as far as possible and not let any pleasing excitement hang around it. Again, we must show prudence by reproving particular faults, not general shortcomings. Punishments are for specific actions, not for defects. She had no experience of schooling as a child, but she came to believe that school life and group living provided an opportunity for character development. It's perhaps surprising to find an overt defense of schooling, but in the face of the movement to homeschool, especially in our country, I'm not sure about elsewhere, it's interesting to read what she has to say. She says, we want to give them, students, the habit of living before a witness, of living in public, which will make them at once fearless and responsible. The necessity of cooperating with others, of being accountable to one's peers, develops leadership. And she contrasts the advantages of school over homeschooling. She notes the positive effect of the traditional school, where the student is immersed in an impressive and dignified atmosphere, where time-honored usages and customs contribute to community building. And with regard to freedom, she says, we must give our children fair play, rope enough to hang themselves by, as the saying goes. They come to us very raw material, quite unformed, and we must put into them the active principle, as it were, make them take their faculties in hand and learn how to use them. She believed in the benefits of making art, of manual work, of gardening. I think she'd applaud the gardening projects that we have heard about at Roehampton and that are taking place now, at least in one school in Atherton. She said, little gardens of their own are perhaps the best gifts which we can give the children. To work in them stirs up not only health, but joy. From growing the humblest annual from a seed packet to grafting roses, there is work for every age. It's of greater value to a child to have grown one perfect flower than to have pulled many to pieces to examine their structure. And finally, she insists that encouragement must be given often. Encouragement helps to fight the daily battle. Approbation rewards the victory. We must encourage in three ways: by recognizing their efforts, by raising their flagging energy, and for this much ingenuity is required. They get so easily tired. And by holding out a hand to raise them when they fall. We should never leave them after scolding without a word of encouragement. Otherwise, who can tell how long it will be before they can rise again? We must never let the children feel that we think them hopeless. They must never get the habit of thinking that they must be bad. They ought never to be without a stimulus to be good, as God never leaves us without one. And she has a funny comment that I want to share too. Children's sympathies, she said, are often excited in the wrong direction. An example is the child who, looking at Doré's engraving of the Christians in the Colosseum, was sad because one poor tiger had no Christian to devour. You all know children like that. Then she says, give them principles, let them seek for the illustrations. We should place before our eyes a high ideal for the scholastic year and ask ourselves often for a definite account of what we're doing for each individual child in our class or division, whether or not we are combating intellectual conceit. Study the child's weak and strong points as she passes from hand to hand. Light is thrown on the work, and possibilities for excellence are developed. And that high ideal that was expressed when she wrote, "A child of the Sacred Heart is very strong, very innocent, and determined to do something for God in her life." Now, in conclusion, I'd like to add that her influence has been recognized in the United States for a long time. Schools and buildings have been named for her. Stewart Hall in San Francisco, Stewart Country Day School in Princeton, where we will have the final network celebration of this centenary. In the early days of the network, we had some educational meetings that we called Stewart Conferences, again, after the importance of her influence in society education. And her writings continue to be read. As I've tried to show, the seeds of the goals and criteria are in her insights. Looking at a growing plant, we do not see the seeds, but obviously they're there. Many of us who read The Education of Catholic Girls, for example, many years ago, have been somewhat surprised and quite gratified to find that many of our lay colleagues coming to the network more recently and coming to Mother Stewart's thought for the first time are quick to recognize in what she writes the relevance of her insights. Some of her observations are dated and not applicable to our context, especially perhaps the social setting, the position of women with regard to women's expectations and the opportunities open to them now. But those reflections and insights that are less limited by time and place are original and valid and speak to today's Sacred Heart educators. In the end, Madeleine Sophie Berra, Janet Stewart, the goals and criteria are all saying the same thing in different voices and idioms. They're expressing the tradition, the family story, all inspired by a single vision. Some years ago, a group of experienced Sacred Heart educators prepared an orientation booklet for those new to the Sacred Heart. They called it The Life Lived, drawing the title from one of the most familiar passages from Janet Stewart's The Education of Catholic Girls. For no one can be educated by maxim and precept. It's the life lived and the things loved and the ideals believed in by which we tell one upon the other. If we want integrity of character, steadiness, reliability, courage, thoroughness, all the harder qualities that serve as a backbone, we make others want them also and strive for them by the power of example that is not set as good example, for that is as tame as a precept, but the example of the life that is lived and the truths that are honestly believed in. Thank you.